Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. I've got to tell you, I'm really glad to be with you. Early this week, uh, I had a rock of Gibraltar in my side, otherwise known as a kidney stone, uh, try to make an appearance. I, I've got a history of kidney stones. As a matter of fact, I have passed 13 kidney stones in my life, and they are unbelievably bad. I've got a saying that says there is no dignity in a kidney stone. And for almost 3 days, I was just sick as a dog. So anyway, feeling much better today. So very, very thankful for that. Boy, am I thankful for that. Uh, uh, the very first kidney stone I ever passed, in the follow-up visit with the doctor, he said, "Well, now you know what it's like for a woman to have a baby." He said, "You just had a baby." I said, "Well, I tell you what, I'm going to put that baby up for adoption because I ain't never having another one." Unfortunately, I was not right. Wow. Oh, they're terrible. Okay, moving right along here. This is video number 16 in our review and refutation of the book by Mr. Kyle Pope entitled Thinking About AD 70. Now, I'm not going to make more than 20 total videos. So this is number 16. So over the next few videos, I'm going to hit what are the most salient of the points and arguments that Mr. Pope attempts to make. Now, I want to say this. If in fact today's video is accurate, proper, and true, all right, then virtually everything else that Mr. Pope has said is falsified. I could say that, by the way, about previous videos in which I have demonstrated that his view of the passing of the law, his view of Israel being cut off at the cross is absolutely, totally false. His view of the Old Testament is false. And because his view of the Old Testament, the passing of the law, and Israel is false, then his theology, his eschatology is false. Because, guess what? All New Testament eschatology was simply the reiteration of the Old Testament promises made to Old Covenant Israel to be fulfilled in Israel's last days, not at the end of the Christian age, which has no end. New Testament eschatology is the reiteration of Old Testament promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Once you understand that, then you understand that throughout this book, every time that Mr. Pope alludes to an Old Testament prophecy for a yet future coming of the Lord, judgment and resurrection, he is defeating his own position about Israel and about the law passing at the cross. That really is sufficient. So anyway, I have to be very candid here. And again, I want to be as kind and respectful as possible. As I have said on many occasions, Mr. Pope seems like a genuinely nice guy from what I can tell. And the demeanor that he sets forth in the book is good. I appreciate that. So, pages 75 and following, Mr. Pope addresses the issue of the resurrection. And he decides to focus on Daniel chapter 7. And he spends a good bit of time in Daniel chapter 11, and no problem with that. I want to grab my Bible here, and I'm going to be turning over there to Daniel because I want to be reading and not quoting so that you get the full force of what I'm going to share with you. Now, what this comes down to, Mr. Pope comes to Daniel chapter 12 after a great long discussion of Daniel chapter 11. And here's what he does. Daniel chapter 12, at that time there shall be great tribulation, such as has never been since there was since there was a nation. Well, Mr. Pope says that occurred in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Then he inserts a so far 2,500-year gap, into the period at the end of verse 1. And thus, he has verse 2 saying, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall arise, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting condemnation. He says that is the end of time. Then, of course, you have many of those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, to those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. And I'll be really honest, I haven't, in reading his comments, I find them so confusing. All I could think about in reading his comments, and again, no disrespect whatsoever to Mr. Pope, but all I could think about were the words smoke and dust and obfuscation. I did not find his arguments to be on point at all. I found them to be diversionary and obfuscatory. But anyway, then we come down to Daniel chapter 12, verse 6. One angel asked another, when shall these things be? How long shall be the fulfillment of these wonders be? And Mr. Pope says, well, the key to understanding verse 6 is the word wonders. And the word wonders has to do with some, wonderful or remarkable event. So he poses, to what wonders does the question refer? Jeremiah used the same Hebrew word describing the disaster of Jerusalem's destruction. Well, thank you very much. At her end, he mourns her fall has been a wonder. Lamentation, chapter 1, verse 9. The angel may be asking, notice the may be asking when these astonishing things will end. If so, this is similar to what was said earlier in Daniel. God would accomplish 70 years in desolations of Jerusalem. He would finish the wonder of Jerusalem's punishment. Daniel is told of a future hardship on Jerusalem. The question asked, when will it be finished? Genesis 15 and verse 16. Of another hardship in AD 70, Luke 21, verse 24. So, he evidently sees. Let me read that again, folks. You've really got to catch the power of what he says here. He, that is the Lord, would finish the wonder of Jerusalem's punishment. Daniel is told of a future hardship on Jerusalem. The question asks, when will it be finished? Genesis 15, 16. Of another hardship in AD 70, Luke 21 and verse 24. Does it not strike you that he says that these wonders, these marvels, is speaking about AD 70? Did I miss something here? Anyway, this would not require that we understand the answer that follows to refer to everything that has been said before this, only the wonders or astonishing and horrible things concerning the persecution. Well, now he seems to revert back to an application of Antiochus Epiphanes. So let me take his points one by one. Point number one, the abomination of desolation. Notice again, Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. There shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. Now, clearly, in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15, Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let the one who reads understand, then let those who are in Judea flee. So, Jesus is speaking about the abomination of desolation, and then he talks about the great tribulation, Matthew 24, verse 21. Here in Daniel, we have the great tribulation, and in verse 9 and following, we have the abomination of desolation. Now, Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. But what does Mr. Pope do? Well, he takes us over to Matthew chapter 24, and he says, I want you to notice what Jesus does here. In Matthew 24:21, Jesus says, notice this, for then shall be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. Oh, so since Jesus adds the little phrase, nor ever shall be, that means, supposedly, it is different from the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, and that means that what Jesus was saying to his apostles was, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, that he wasn't saying that Daniel predicted what he was talking about. What he was really saying here was Daniel foretold the abomination of desolation and the great tribulation of the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, and now Jesus was saying to his apostles, when you see something like that, know that the time is near. Now, here's what's remarkable. This is to restrict Hebraic expression, journalistic expression, and to make it conform to your concept of things. And let me illustrate what I mean. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, this great tribulation, notice the language again. There will be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. Oh, now wait a minute. If this applies to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, then it was absolutely false. Michael was wrong. The angel was wrong. Why is that? Well, here's the reason. The desolations, and that's too powerful a word, the time of trouble under Antiochus Epiphanes did not approach, not even remotely, the destruction of the people, the temple, and the city in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. In the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the temple was leveled. The city was leveled. The people carried off into captivity. So if Daniel 12:1 is talking about the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, then the temple, the city, had to have been utterly, totally destroyed at that time, and the people sent off into captivity. But here's the absolute historical truth. That did not happen under Antiochus Epiphanes. What happened in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, Antiochus came up against Jerusalem. He besieged it. He did break through the walls. He did set fire to a lot of the city. But point number one, he did not destroy the city. Point number two, Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple by offering a pig on the altar of the temple, which meant it defiled the temple and the altar. He did not destroy the temple. And point number 3, guess what? He didn't carry the nation of Judah off into captivity. So, according to Mr. Pope's own hermeneutic, according to Mr. Pope's own journalistic and literary demand, that, well, you know, since Jesus said nothing like it ever again, that means it's different from the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, then that means that by that same journalistic hermeneutical rule, he has eliminated the time of Antiochus Epiphanes from being the application of Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. Because the time of Antiochus Epiphanes did not approach the destruction at the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Mr. Pope has falsified his own argument. And then, you got to take note of this. You've just got to take, you got to catch the power of this, folks. As an amillennialist, Mr. Pope would eschew the dispensational practice of inserting humongous gaps of time between verses. Here's what I mean. As I'm sure you're aware, the dispensationalist comes to Daniel chapter 9, 24 to 27. 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon your holy city, or upon your city and a holy people. And the dispensationalists say, well, that 70 weeks are determined to establish the kingdom. Jesus came and offered the kingdom to Israel. Israel rejected it. Therefore, God withdrew the kingdom. He established the church, which he had never predicted anywhere in the Bible beforehand. And he's been dealing with the church for the last 2,000 years. However, at the rapture, which of course we're told is any time now. By the way, it's actually supposed to have been September 25th. So, boy, folks, here we are. We're still here. Anyway, God will rapture the church, begin dealing with Israel once again. So they insert a 2,000-year gap, actually a 2,500-year gap, between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9. Yeah, 2,000 years. Anyway, so how do the amillennialists, like Mr. Pope, deal with the dispensationalists on that? They tell us there's no justification for inserting a 2,000-year gap between the 69th and the 70th week. Where do you find that in Daniel? And the answer to that is, you don't. You have to have a presuppositional theological paradigm that you impose onto the text in order to justify inserting a 2,000-year gap between the 69th and the 70th week. But guess what? That is precisely what Mr. Pope does. Here's what he does. The time of the Great Tribulation, time of Antiochus Epiphanes. That's the 2nd century BC. That was the Great Tribulation. Oh, and then, verse 2, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall arise. And so what we are supposed to believe is that Yahweh, parenthetically, as an, oh, by the way, for those who suffer during that time of great tribulation, one of these days by and by, you know, at the end of time, there's going to be a resurrection, and they will shine like the brightness of the firmament. 2,200-year gap in the period at the end of verse 1. But let's take note not only of that inconsistency, that self-contradictory inconsistency in Mr. Pope's view, but I want to move on. In verse 6, again, one said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? So, Mr. Pope says, well, you see here the key is the word wonders. It is used in Lamentations to speak of the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jeremiah used the same word describing Jerusalem's destruction. And he says, if so. You see, he is postulating a possibility between what happened in BC 586 in the definition of the word wonder, only this time he's applying it to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, wait a minute. Once again, the time of the desolation of Lamentations, of the wonder of Lamentations and Jeremiah in Lamentations, remember, that was total destruction. But now, Mr. Pope wants to use it of the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, when the language of Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 forbids that application. Listen, folks, you just got to catch that. Let me reiterate. Mr. Pope's own hermeneutic, oh, well, you know, Jesus said it'd be a great tribulation, nothing like it ever again. Well, okay, if the difference in wording and if the difference of application demands a difference in time and application and interpretation, then surely the fact that Daniel was told it would be a tribulation such as had never ever been before. Well, the subject is Jerusalem, and the subject in Lamentations is Jerusalem, two different time periods, both, according to Mr. Pope, are wonders. But wait, that in the days of Jeremiah was greater than that in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. But Mr. Pope's hermeneutic demands that what was going to happen in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes was greater than that in the time of Jeremiah. Again, I hate to be repetitious, but this is important, was greater than that in the time of Jeremiah, and that falsifies Mr. Pope. But I must move on. Now, what Mr. Pope is doing, it's really amazing. Ask yourself the following question. Okay, would this great tribulation be a wonder? Well, Mr. Pope says obviously so. Well, let me ask you a question. Would the resurrection not be a wonder and a marvel and an amazement? Does the word wonder have to apply strictly and solely to a time of destruction? Where would Mr. Pope find that justification? I mean, after all, I would suggest that if the resurrection is anything closely resembling what Mr. Pope says, a time-ending, earth-burning, cosmos-destroying event in which all the wicked are judged and sent to hell, all the righteous are judged and sent to heaven, I'm telling you what, that's quite a marvel. That's quite a wonder. So, for him to be so arbitrary, downright capricious in his definition of wonder, number one, has no linguistic validity to it. Just because he can go to Jeremiah and Lamentations and say, well, see what a wonder meant there, doesn't mean that it excludes the resurrection or the time of the end of verse 3. Now watch. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. And I got to tell you, his comments on Daniel couldn't seal the book up until the time of the end because Daniel wouldn't live until the time of the end. There's nothing in the text to suggest that that's what it's saying. Daniel was to put a seal on the book. The book would remain sealed until the time of the end. And notice what it says. Verse 8. Daniel says, I did not understand. Then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these, it's an elliptical statement, these things? Well, what would be the antecedent to these things? Oh, I don't know. It might be the tribulation, the resurrection, the righteous shining forth as the stars, the time of the end. But you see, Mr. Pope cannot have verse 6 applying to all of these things. only things of destruction. But you see, verse 7 says, I heard the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand, his left hand to heaven, and swore to him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times and a half time. And Mr. Pope tries once again to throw up a cloud of dust, cloud of smoke, and obfuscate. No, let's focus on when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be fulfilled. So once again, Mr. Pope says, well, all these things doesn't mean all these things. Where would you ever get the idea that he's not talking about all these things? And Mr. Pope once again will say, oh, well, it's the word wonder. That's a misuse of the linguistics. We're supposed to believe that the angel says, I'm really, really curious about when this great tribulation is going to be. I'm not concerned about the resurrection here. Don't worry, I'm not worried about that at all. But just tell me when this great tribulation will be. Seriously? And that means the angel is saying, listen, I'm not concerned about the time of the end here. That doesn't concern me. I just want to know about the great tribulation. I'm not concerned about when the righteous will shine forth as the stars. I'm not concerned about that. I'm just concerned about this great tribulation. You see, ladies and gentlemen, what that does is that essentially has the angel saying, when shall these things be? When shall one of these things be? The great tribulation. He wasn't asking about the time of the end. He wasn't asking about the righteous shining forth in the kingdom at the time of the end. And he wasn't asking about the resurrection. He was only asking about the tribulation. Why would he ask about when shall these things, plural, be fulfilled, when in reality he's only asking about one thing, the great tribulation? I got to hurry. Okay, then Mr. Pope does another attempt, and he says, who are the holy people here? And he tries to argue, well, it can't be. It cannot be the unrighteous in Israel. It has to be the righteous remnant. Well, and the reason he does that is because he says, you know, the holy people here, they weren't really all that holy. God brought judgment on them because of their sin. Therefore, they weren't holy. Well, let's see. Daniel 9, verse 24. Daniel, let's go back there and read that, shall we? 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. Well, wait a minute. Jerusalem, which was destroyed in 586 BC, was not righteous and holy. She was so unholy that God told Jeremiah chapter 8, Jeremiah, don't pray for this people. Don't pray for this city. They're totally corrupt. And Jeremiah said, Lord, if I can find 50 righteous people in the city, will you spare it? Yes, I will. Well, Lord, if I can find 40, will you spare it? Yes, I will. And Jeremiah got down and said, well, Lord, if I can find 10? Lord says, yeah, I'll spare it even for 10. And Jeremiah couldn't find 10 righteous people in the city. Yet, here, in that instance, in the time of Jeremiah, that city was so corrupt. Well, guess what? In Matthew chapter 12, 43 and following, Jesus said Jerusalem and Israel of his day was going to be the worst generation ever. And he called it a wicked and adulterous generation. Yet Daniel is predicting the final end of that, quote, holy city. Therefore, Mr. Pope's argument, well, you can't make this holy people to be Israel because they weren't really holy. Well, Daniel called them holy people, and he called them the holy city doomed to destruction. You see, what happens here is that Mr. Pope is literally grasping at broken straws. And I'm out of time. But I want to close with this. Mr. Pope puts this resurrection at the end of time. He comes down to verse 13. Daniel, go your way. You will sleep with your fathers. But at the time of the end, you will arise to your inheritance. And Mr. Pope says, see, that's the end of time. Well, in Revelation chapter 11, we find the destruction of the city where the Lord was crucified. Revelation 11 verse 8. What follows at that very time? Well, Revelation 11, 15 and following. The seventh angel sounded, that's the seventh trumpet, which is the last trumpet, which is the trumpet of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. There were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ, and they shall rule, he shall rule forever and ever. And the 24 elders sat before God on their thrones, fell on their faces and worshiped God, saying, we give you thanks, O Lord God Almighty, the one who is, who was, and who is to come, because you have taken your great power and reigned. When? At the destruction of the city. The nations were angry. Your wrath has come. The time of the dead, that they should be judged, that you should reward your servants, the prophets, and the saints. Wait a minute. Daniel chapter 12, resurrection. Daniel chapter 12, the rewarding of the prophets. You know, Daniel. Revelation 11, the destruction of the city where the Lord was crucified, and the time of the dead that they should be judged, the time of the rewarding of the prophets. Well, where was the Lord crucified? You know where it was. And that means that Daniel predicted the resurrection at the time of the destruction of the power of the holy people. Revelation 11 describes the impending judgment of Babylon, the city where the Lord was crucified, and it's at that time that the resurrection would take place, did take place, and that means, ladies and gentlemen, that Kyle Pope's attempt at dichotomizing Daniel chapter 12, Mr. Pope's attempt to redefine all in Daniel chapter 12, Mr. Pope's attempt to redefine wonders, they all fail. Because the comparison between Daniel 12, and Revelation 11 proves categorically the resurrection was in AD 70. I'm out of time. Thank you so much for joining me on this morning's Morning Musings. You have a fantastic weekend. I'll see you on Monday.